Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sparking Student Inquiry with Podcasts. I'm Marielle Palumbo. I'm the Director of Curriculum at ListenWise, and I'm here with Laura Krenicki, a ListenWise advocate who teaches 6th grade World Cultures and Geography at William J. Johnston Middle School in Colchester, Connecticut.
Hi, everybody.
So we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about teaching inquiry with podcasts. We'll first talk about the what and the why, and then we'll move on to the how, illustrated with some very rich classroom examples that Laura will share. If you'd like to check out the podcast we'll be discussing for yourself, you can go to listenwise.com to start exploring content and sign up as a teacher if you don't already have an account. And you will receive, after this podcast, a recording of the podcast, and also if you sign up with URL at the end, we'll send you the slides as well, and they have some links that are live that will take you to all the resources we talk about in case we go too quickly. So I'm going to hand it off to Laura for the next bit.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, hi everybody. I apologize for my voice. I've been under the weather this weekend, so I sound a little bit lower than normal. But I did want to share one of these stories. This one is called The Lost Boys of Sudan. It's something I've used in teaching inquiry, and we'll talk more about what I did in my class later. But for now, we're just going to play you a little part of the story.
So just sit back and listen.
His name is Daniel Majuk Guy. He's one of the Lost Boys. Those were children separated from their families during Sudan's civil war. Daniel still has nightmares of the day in 1987 when a militia from the north attacked his village.
My father was out there in the field, trying to look for our cattle. They came and attacked the home. I ran in a different direction that I was not even know. So from then, I never returned home.
He ran alone, and like so many of the Lost Boys, he kept running. It was a nomadic existence for more than a decade. Daniel moved on foot for hundreds of miles, spending time in refugee camps in Ethiopia and Kenya. 14 years after first fleeing, Daniel was at a camp in Kenya with nearly 60,000 other refugees. He kept paying attention to this bulletin board. If his name showed up, it would mean he was leaving to be resettled.
There was a bulletin board that take only 90 name. And when you see your name, you're knowing that you are flying to Nairobi and Nairobi to wherever you are taken. A friend of mine came and said, "Hey, Daniel, you are leaving on the 2nd of September. I say, "You kidding?" I say, "For sure." I came and it was Daniel Majogai there on the board. I look at it closely and it says, "You are going to Denver, Colorado."
And Denver became Daniel's new home. He became an American citizen and he went to college. Eventually, he was reunited with most of his family, who it turned out had also survived. In 2011, Daniel decided to move back to his homeland, and he's been working for a nonprofit there, helping to build schools. He got married and was living in the South Sudanese city of Bor with his wife, their infant son, and also Daniel's elderly father. Then, last month, violence caught up with Daniel again. Shooting erupted in Bor. Daniel rounded up his family and they headed for the swampy forest.
The moment we found ourselves in the forest, there was nothing for us to eat. The children were crying, the mothers were speechless, and there was nowhere that these people can survive. So I told a cousin of mine, two of them, I said, "We have to get back to town."
Okay, so hopefully you want to hear more, and you can go to ListenWise and hear the rest of the story. But we just want to give you a little bit of a taste of one of the podcasts that we will be talking about today. We have a few questions. Okay, go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I was just also thinking, when you had the audio up, I don't know if the listeners could also see that there was a transcript that was available, and that is often helpful for students because of sometimes the accent of the speaker. Having that as an extra text is very helpful. But we want you to take a moment and reflect on the experience of listening to the story. And as you think about those questions, you can respond to any of them on the chat box on the side. And if you don't see where that is, there's a speech bubble in the upper right corner. near your gear, so you are welcome to turn that on and tell us what you're thinking in the chat. Those of you who can't see that, Laura had an interesting comment about how Daniel was an excellent storyteller, describing the environment around him, what he was feeling and experiencing. And Adrienne says the story covered a long period of time in just a few sentences. So she had questions about all of what happened in between the events he shared in the audio.
Ooh, I hear inquiry.
I hear inquiry. And actually, I'm glad you brought those, actually both those questions up or comments up, because we're going to talk a little bit more about them as this webinar continues. And we will return to the story later, and I'll let you know how we ended up using it in the classroom.
Feel free to continue sharing your thoughts in the chat.
Yes, please do.
So, as many of you may have noticed, listening really immerses you in a scene, making you feel as though you're right there. Some researchers have coined a concept known as immersed experiencer view, which means that understanding language is somewhat akin to actually being present and experiencing the events the language describes. Evidence indicates that when listening, people's minds are simulating what it would be like to be there in a scene in a multisensory way. I don't know if you had that experience when you were listening to Daniel, but I certainly was imagining myself where he was as best I can. Listening can also offer a critical pathway to empathy, which can help to drive inquiry and support social and emotional learning. That speaks directly to the comments that participants made, actually. And of course, storytelling is powerful. Good stories have the power to captivate even the most reluctant students. Stories told aloud allow the listener to connect emotionally to the people speaking. This may not always happen when students are struggling to read, focusing their energy on decoding a text. Or even if they're not struggling, actually, hearing people in their own voices is very qualitatively different from reading their words in print. Audio can move students emotionally. It can help students put themselves in someone else's shoes and really feel that experience. This sort of engagement can motivate students to wonder about other dimensions of the experience, what might have happened before or afterwards, and ask questions to deepen their understanding of the circumstances. In addition to these benefits, listening to engaging stories can also support literacy more broadly. According to research published in the Elementary School Journal, 23 major studies found correlations between reading and listening. In general, the poor reader is also likely to be a poor listener. Research shows listening comprehension is the dominating influence on reading comprehension beyond the early grades. Thus, building listening skills can help students develop reading skills. For students who are struggling with comprehension, auditory content can help to close the gap. Research suggests that repeated exposures to words used naturally in multiple contexts is critical to expanding students' vocabularies. So we can use complex audio texts with high value, high level vocabulary to build students' academic vocabulary and background knowledge, which is increasingly important as students transition from learning to read to reading to learn. You may have noticed that the ListenWise platform includes interactive transcripts, which Laura mentioned, so students can read while they listen. Research also indicates that listening and reading together can increase accuracy by 52%. Although listening is known to be an important piece of the literacy puzzle, it is often given less attention in classroom instruction than other literacy skill building activities. Whoop, sorry.
All right, everyone, I think it's time to get started.
Sorry, too many clicks. This is a prior webinar, actually. So one of the reasons for the fact that listening may be absent from its instruction more than other strands of literacy skills is that historically it's been difficult to assess listening comprehension with validity and reliability. However, ListenWise has partnered with Metametrics, which is the creator of the Lexile reading level that may be familiar to some of you, to develop a Lexile listening level. So for anyone interested in learning more about measuring listening skills with the new Lexile listening measure, which will be launching in January, you can check out this other webinar on that topic by clicking on the link on this slide, which I just did accidentally. Oh, again.
We appreciate you coming.
Let's see. There we go. Nope.
We appreciate you coming.
All right. How can I get my slide advanced without clicking on that? There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Took up too much real estate. So that was a quick dip into the background behind the value of teaching with audio texts. And now we'll talk specifically about using podcasts in the classroom and how they can support teaching inquiry. So a report by the Gates Foundation titled The Silent Epidemic, focused on why high school students drop out, identified that one of the top 5 reasons is because they do not feel that what they're learning is connected to the real world. They want teachers to improve curriculum and instruction to make school more relevant and engaging, enhancing the connection between school and the world beyond it. They need to see the connection between going to school and joining the world of work and citizenship. And audio stories can be used in addressing a wide variety of curriculum standards, including listening comprehension, as we've discussed, and other Common Core literacy skills, reading, writing, and speaking, as well as content standards in social studies and science. They can help students build academic language and background knowledge, as well as supporting social and emotional learning. And as you'll soon hear from Laura's examples, they can also help students develop critical thinking and inquiry skills. One of the benefits of using podcasts as instructional materials is that they equalize access to engaging academic content for all students, including English language learners and struggling or reluctant readers. The design of the ListenWise platform intentionally includes many built-in supports to differentiate instruction, such as the interactive transcripts you saw that help ensure that all learners can access the same high-quality texts. So it's really a universal design for learning kind of approach to building the platform. And ListenWise's collection of audio stories that are curated for classroom use with accompanying instructional materials is always growing. These current events and standards aligned lessons can be flexibly integrated into instruction in classrooms across grade levels and subjects. And the stories are drawn from the work of master storytellers. They're really high quality, well-produced short podcasts that are covering a wide range of topics. There are also some of the supports that I mentioned include lesson plans, scaffolding for different learners, listening organizers, comprehension and discussion questions, and quizzes, auto scoring quizzes. So now I'm going to hand off back to Laura to talk a little bit about some specific standards that podcasts in this collection can help to address.
Great. And if you don't mind, and those of you on the chat, I'm just interested to know what subjects and or what grade levels you're teaching. So if you don't mind, while we're going through some of the standards, maybe you could just pop on there just so we kind of get a sense of the audience that we have here. And while that's populating, I do want to mention that that ListenWise is connected obviously to the Common Core skills. These 4 are under this, or the first 2 are the speaking and listening strands, and the other ones are writing strands. But you'll notice that the stories are all connected to students understanding what they're hearing, but then also comprehending it and then rating what they understand from that comprehension. Oh, great. So we have an English teacher on here too. Great. I do want to mention that although my focus is on social studies and the humanities, and I thought I probably should preface that, there are some examples here. These Common Core ones relate especially to inquiry. And because I'm in the department with social studies and humanities, we collaborate on content and skills with our ELA counterparts. You know, everything's data driven. So whatever the kids are struggling in, it's something that we are going to work on together. Hold on one second. So sorry, I have a tickle. Anyway, the other thing is that we have a shared responsibility for the standards, and we're assessed equally through the teacher evaluation process. So likewise, students might use the stories in my class and then again in their ELA class. And we deliberately use the same academic language as Marielle had said, so that students know what it is that we expect. And then diving a little deeper, because my content area is social studies, we are connected to the C3 dimensions of inquiry. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the C3, it stands for college, career, and civic life, which we all hope our students can come out of their K-12 experience knowing and understanding. And one of the key purposes of the C3 is to align academic programs to the Common Core state standards for English language arts and literacy in history and social studies. So by providing a framework for inquiry, teachers can help students develop questions using close reading skills, evaluating and gathering sources, and then, of course, communicating conclusions. And if you're looking at those dimensions, that fourth step, it says that they could also potentially take informed action as well. And thank you for those of you on the comments. I'm glad to see that we have a real variety here. So thank you for sharing your backgrounds. So in Connecticut, which is where I live, we actually worked on aligning that C3 document with the Common Core into a social studies frameworks for grades K through 12. And this is a screenshot from our page. You'll notice that the 4 dimensions of inquiry are on the left, so theme 4, and then some areas where it aligns on the right to strands in the Common Core strands in reading, writing, and speaking and listening. Okay, I'm going to jump down to, here's another example of a portion of our middle grades World Regional Studies course. Shows how we develop questioning and planning in Dimension 1, but then you'll also, I don't know if you can see the font there, it shows references to the C3 document, the Common Core, but that ListenWise is a useful tool for that inquiry 6 to 8.5, that using different types of sources that take into consideration multiple points of view. And that example that you already heard in the story can give you a different point of view and perhaps even multiple voices depending on the story that you're listening to. So taking a look at some of our inquiry lessons using the podcasts. And I'm going to go kind of quickly through this. I don't know if you are familiar with, this is a great infographic by Trevor McKenzie, who talks about different types of student inquiry. A lot of times teachers feel that giving students time for inquiry might seem unrealistic, and they are afraid of it being too unstructured. However, Trevor McKenzie describes here a kind of a tiered scaffold for teaching inquiry. And if you follow from left to right, you know, we may spend quite a bit of time on that left side with the structure, and then hopefully as the year moves on, then you can start releasing some of the responsibility back to students. So we'll walk through some types of inquiries and how you can release control to your students. So here's one of the examples. Now, knowing that my content is probably different than yours, these are just examples of some of the resources that we used using ListenWise. This is not, you know, the be all end all, but, you know, feel free to use any of this if it helps you. So here's an example of a structured inquiry that can be done in an ELA class or a social study class using, I love the book, A Long Walk to Water by Linda Sue Park. And if anybody here is using Linda Sue Park, you know, go ahead and let us know on the side. That would be great too. This particular story is about a young man who was caught up in the Sudan Civil War. And then he suddenly had to flee his village and become a refugee. After the first chapter of the book, we analyze what we would do in a similar situation. So we literally read the first chapter and then we pause it and go to a Listen Why story. And there together, we listen to a Doctors Without Borders experience on Listen Whys. And the story there is insight into the refugee experience. We discuss the choices refugees have to make. Students then decide what things they would grab and take with them in an emergency, and they share their voices on a Flipgrid topic. Now, I don't know if any of you have a phone or device handy by, but if you do, that QR code, if you hover your phone over it, it will pop up and you'll actually see an example of a student who describes how he goes to his house and he gathers those 5 things that he would take with him if he suddenly had to leave his home. So that would be a more structured inquiry. We listen to it together, we listen to the story together, and then the students work on their inquiry together. Now, moving on, we can now release a little bit more of control. This is a controlled inquiry where, excuse me, after we finish the book, Linda Sue Park, which I see that Denise also likes that book. It's such a great story. We also watch a documentary called God Grew Tired of Us that shows what it's like for a Sudanese refugee to resettle in the United States. The documentary follows 3 young men in their first year in America and then the challenges that they face. At the end of the documentary, one of the men returns to South Sudan to marry his girlfriend. And that Listen Why story that we listened to then follows this documentary because it's that radio interview with Daniel. However, I don't know, there's a Daniel in the documentary, and I don't know if it's the same person, but the story and his name sound very familiar. And since students in grade 6 struggle with inferring in written text, that's one of our weakest areas that we found. Connecting this interview, the one you heard, with their background knowledge from both the story and the documentary, it helps them to more accurately infer and ask good questions that will now drive their inquiry. Then taking that a step further, this is where the guided part steps in. We ask students, we start this in the beginning, this is our compelling question, that is the book A Long Walk to Water a book about water? And if you remember those dimensions of the inquiry, that level 4 was the communicating conclusions and taking informed action. This is where they would take that biggest step. They would communicate their conclusions this way. What we ask students to do then is to answer that question based on the information that they have from the story and from all these other types of texts. They can produce their own type of a product. It could be a whiteboard animation, it could be a PSA, it could be a poster board, it can be whatever type of conclusion they would like to explain how their story, if they think the book A Long Walk to Water is really a book about water. Again, we have 2 examples of Flipgrids there. If you want to pop them up, you're welcome to. And we also ask students to take a look at the Listen Why story about helping refugees adapt to US culture. For those of you who know the story, one of the characters comes to the United States and has to resettle here. And you heard that too also in the story from Daniel's beginning. However, we find that a lot of times the refugees come and then they don't have as much support on this end. So now we're taking that next step of the taking informed action. We invited some local refugee resettlement agency to bring some refugees in who are living in our community to not only get to talk with them and meet with them, but also for us to find out what ways that we could make our community more welcoming to those refugees. And another example of a guided inquiry is one we actually did just recently, is the time capsule story. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of the time capsule that was found up in Boston, but our guiding question for this is, how do we learn about the past? And so when we use that guiding question about how do we learn about the past, we actually, I don't know if you can see in the bottom left corner there, in our school building, we just had a renovation. And when they demolished a section of the building, we found a time capsule that we didn't know existed. So we use that as a starting point. We look at the things that were left from our past, what we can learn about our town. And then we use that Listen Why's time capsule story about one that was found in Boston to help assess listening comprehension, listening for evidence, because quite a few things are mentioned in that story. And then we ask them to make personal connections and then connecting their past to their present. So by using objects and artifacts of their own, students created a virtual time capsule. And we made if you want to take a look, the story, the virtual time capsule link is there, and we use Buncee and Flipgrid to integrate them together. And then interestingly, a student recently went with his family on the Freedom Trail up in Boston, and then he saw that that Listen Wise time capsule is still on display. So what a great connection, brings it all the way back around for them. And our last example here is that last step, that free inquiry. So once students have the process of knowing how to find good sources and how to ask those questions, and then they feel a little bit more comfortable using the technology, they have their skills now to develop their own questions, inquiry questions, and research. So we provide opportunities for students to research issues related to the global goals and to share those products with our global collaboration partners. In addition, coming up pretty soon, the World of 7 Billion project, which is by the Population Connection, provides a unique opportunity for students to research issues related to the increasing global population and then make a PSA identifying challenges and possible solutions. So using podcasts as a source of authentic voices and points of view is powerful for students and in their research. Then they can use ListenWise site to not only find their, to do their research on their chosen topics. And we don't have time to share it, but I do have a student from earlier named Luke, who he was great. He found that ListenWise, which was such a good resource for him, that he actually made a project about ListenWise for Digital Learning Day, and he has a great little video there. So if anybody has time to go back and check it out, he's quite a ham. So you can find out what student impressions are of using ListenWise.
I highly recommend it. It's fun watching.
Yeah, he's kind of character. Yeah. So here's on the next page here, the student research page. So if students have, if you have a premium account, students are able to search for their own stories. And believe it or not, I didn't realize this at first. I didn't know students had the ability to search. I thought only the teachers did. So if I thought that, I'm sure others will as well. But if students are logged in and Marielle circled the Find Story section, they can research a topic, and maybe something on climate, and I think about 15 stories come up just on that one topic. So there's quite a few things that are there, and there's also collections of stories. So students don't necessarily have to wade through them all. They could just go to a collection and find some resources there as well. So how might you think about using audio stories to teach inquiry? I know we went through a lot just now, but if you have some ideas how you could use a story to teach inquiry, if you don't mind popping it in the chat box, that would be great.
It may be that you already have done some things,
yeah,
with teaching inquiry using audio, or have some ideas based on what you just heard. So we welcome any thoughts you want to share.
I know that might have been a fire hose approach, getting it all out there. But again, all these resources are going to be available after the webinar is over. So feel free to go through the links and look at the QR codes and see if there's anything there that might help assist you in developing your inquiries.
So we're also, in addition to, it may take a moment to pull together your thoughts and answer this question. So feel free to add those in the chat box at any point in the next couple of minutes. And in the meantime, if you have questions that you'd like to ask, we'd also be happy to entertain those. If there's something you want to hear a little bit more about, or a question about something that we didn't address, please feel free to ask those questions as well. We'll give you a minute now to share and or ask in the chat box.
I'm going to just jump into for a second, because Laura mentioned how your students are eager to create audio, but they struggle to tell the story. And I agree. That is definitely something that students will have a hard time doing, especially if they don't have a framework to set that up. So it may be worth saying what makes a good story, and go through those steps. And then if they could agree that those are the parts um, the parts of the story that make it compelling, then maybe then they could reframe their audio so that they can make sure they hit all those points.
You may also want to sort of look for mentor podcasts in the collection and have students listen to a really well-told story and analyze what makes it a good story. And I always used to, when I started any project with my students, I would start with the question of what makes a good, whatever, story, play, exhibit, house, um, and invite them to sort of brainstorm criteria for quality, drawing upon rich examples as a source. And there are many really well told stories in the collection. So that's another tool that you might use.
I'm also seeing Adrienne's comment about having students form their own questions. I don't know if you're familiar with a question formulation technique or the QFT, and if you are interested in that, it's the rightquestion.org. They're based out of Boston, and they have a framework for using, they call it a question focus. And I think this is a perfect example of finding a story, especially if you just play it in the classroom and use that as a starting point for students then to create their own questions as they're listening. I think that would be a fantastic use of a podcast for helping students generate questions. But if they go through that process, the QFT process, and they can kind of narrow it down and decide what questions they really want answered, and that could be the basis of your QFT, of your QFT inquiry.
I also want to point people to the ListenWise support site. We have lots of articles, blog posts that address some of these topics. There are a couple of good articles about student podcasting. We also are working on a student podcasting professional development module, which allows you to create a project in the company of a cohort of colleagues with guidance, expert guidance, and personalized coaching as you design and implement that project. And there's some articles about student podcasting on that support site. There's some a great blog post that Laura wrote about the projects she just described, which give a little bit more detail and some more links to related resources. And there are many other resources that might be of interest to folks there based on your questions. These are such great questions and comments. I wish we had a lot longer. We're happy to
I was just
stay if
thinking.
you want to.
Yeah.
So feel free to continue asking, but our time is a lot of times officially over. So feel free to drop off, and we'll send you the podcast as well. But if you have additional questions and want to ask them, we're still here. So for those who may be departing, thank you so much for attending. It was great. Your thoughtful contributions really added to the presentation, the webinar, and we appreciate your interest. Anybody else want to ask anything else before we sign off? Oh, let's see. I forgot. We have a few extra resources right here on the last slide as well. So that's a link to Laura's blog post I just mentioned. There's a little bit more about Trevor McKenzie's types of inquiry framework. And I'll throw the support link on there too. I neglected to do that.
Yeah, and I also put together a wakelet of some of my
great.
stories that I provide for the students. So sometimes they don't know what to search. I have 6th graders, so they just don't know what to search for yet. So I put together like my own collection of stories on Wakelet, and I added a few Newsella texts that complement those along in that Wakelet link. So you're welcome to use those if you like.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. It was a really great group.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Bye.